I'm seeing a lot of talk from my colleagues on the left too as we shift toward this reinvigorated talk about Jim Crow and the past of this country. And as someone who is a direct descendant of a slave, as someone whose great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation, I can assure you, slavery is over. Jim Crow is dead. When I go anywhere, I don't see any white-only signs. I don't, I promise you. I am a black man that represents a white majority district in Texas. The great-great-grandson of a man born on a plantation stands before you today as a proud conservative Republican from Texas, as a believer and follower in Christ, and as a believer in what this country can be if we allow equality for not just Muslim Americans, not just Buddhist Americans, but also Christian Americans like yourself. God bless you, young man. You give me a lot of hope for the future of this country. Thank you for having the courage to yield back the remainder of my time.
What actually happens when a media figure, someone with a national platform, decides the best way to respond to a black congressman is to question his marriage, his kids, and his right to look in the mirror? And that's what we're breaking down today. Two men, two completely different worldviews, and one moment that exposed a lot more than either of them probably intended. Don Lemon, former CNN anchor Wesley Hunt, black Republican congressman from Texas, whose great grandfather was born on a plantation. Every clip, every comment broken down in plain English, no outrage, just facts and common sense. So, starting with Wesley Hunt, which we did, because you can't evaluate the response without understanding what was actually said first. Hunt graduated from West Point, served as an Army officer, and then ran for Congress in Texas. Not just any district, a majority white district, and he won. That matters for context because it means a significant number of white voters in Texas looked at a black Republican and said, that's our guy. Whether you agree with his politics or not, that's a real thing that happened. Now, here's what triggered this whole controversy. Hunt was on camera, as you guys seen in the clip, addressing the growing conversation on the left about Jim Crow, systemic racism, in America's racial history. And he said something that some people found inspiring and some people found infuriating. He said, as a direct descendant of slaves, as someone whose great-great-grandfather, was literally born on a plantation. And he can assure you that slavery is over. Jim Crow is dead. And he said he travels his district and doesn't see a single white-only sign anywhere. And then he said the great-great-grandson of a man born on a plantation stands before you today as a proud conservative Republican, a follower of Christ, and a believer in what this country can be. Now, let's be honest about what he's actually saying, because a lot of people heard that and immediately went to a political place. Strip the politics out. What he's really saying is this: the path forward isn't backwards. It's not that the history doesn't matter. He literally invoked his own family's history to make the point is that he refuses to let that history be the ceiling on what his life can look like. That's not a new idea. After the Civil War ended, freed black Americans built entire communities with almost nothing. Greenwood, Oklahoma, what people called Black Wall Street, was built from the ground up by people who had every reason to believe the system would fail them, and they built anyway. They built churches, they built schools, they built banks. They did it because they believed in an aspirational future, not because they ignored the painful past. And Hunt's message sits in that same tradition: faith, family, hard work, equal opportunity. These aren't conservative talking points invented last Tuesday. They're the same values that carried black families through some of the hardest chapters in American history. And that's the foundation of everything he said. So now let's look at how Don Lemon responded to that, because the response is where the story really starts.
Appearing to have no historic or current knowledge of the state of America and race relations. But he actually thinks he's not like them. You know what I'm saying? The N-words.
This reinvigorated talk about Jim Crow and the past of this country. And as someone who is a direct descendant of a slave, as someone whose great-great-grandfather was born on a plantation, I can assure you, slavery is over. Jim Crow is dead.
What kind of self-hatred, self-hating person could even think that? What kind of self-hatred and delusion must you have in order to even think something like that? How do you even look in the mirror? How do you sleep at night? What do you tell your kids? What do you tell your kids? What do you tell your black kids? Because I don't know. I think maybe he's in an interracial marriage. I have nothing against that, but your kids are still black, right? Because you're in an interracial marriage. So what do you tell your kids? How do you deal with your constituents? He says, "Well, I'm in I'm in a majority white district, but maybe that's why he feels that he is not like them, that he's one of them."
Don Lemon's response came in several pieces. So now that you guys seen that one, because we're gonna go through each one, it's a second one, and then I'll tie it all together. But we're gonna go through each one and break down what's actually happening. Because the first thing Lemon said was directed at Hunt's character. He asked how Hunt looks in the mirror and how does he sleep at night, as you guys heard. Now I want you guys to see the second clip in regards of him and Joy Reid speaking on Wesley Hunt's remarks. Check it out.
As smart as I know my ass is, Ketanji Brown is smarter. Smartest person I've ever met in my life. When you smart, I'm smart. That lady is smart on a level I've never seen before. And her 3 roommates were even smarter. These girls were so smart that we were shocked that we'd ever met anybody that intelligent. And Amy Coney Barrett, on the other hand, is a Supreme Court justice just like Ketanji, even though her qualifications are minuscule compared to Ketanji's. Maybe that's the affirmative action we've been getting. White people who are essentially mediocre in scale compared to a black person getting the spot because they wanted a conservative. Maybe the way that J.D. Vance got into Yale is because they were tired of just letting in white men from New York, from Choate, from all the elite schools, and they wanted an Appalachian white. That's how that man got into Yale, I promise you. Same thing with Ron DeSantis from a small town in Florida. They wanted to just get out of the New York, D.C. matrix, Massachusetts matrix, and let somebody into Harvard and Yale who came from a different place. He came from Florida. Baby, that's also affirmative action and DEI. So before y'all start going crazy about DEI just meaning they let black people in just on the basis of being black, think a little more critically and think about the fact that it's also disabled people, military veterans, people who come from Appalachia, white folks who come from Alaska and different places that they don't normally come from, indigenous people, Latinos, Asians. And the last thing I'll say about this, for all of y'all people on Fox that are going to clip this because y'all mad about affirmative action, because yes, I embrace affirmative action because I belonged at Harvard and I was smarter than all the legacies I went to school with, who only were there because they were rich and their parents had a name on one of the buildings and they didn't go to class and I did. So I'm just going to let y'all know that we see affirmative action as these schools searching for people they wouldn't have ordinarily found without deliberately looking for us. They would have just let the same mediocre white men from rich families in. But instead, they let me in. And because of that, you now have the ability to attack me, right wingers. You have the ability to know who I am when I don't know who most of y'all are. But you know me because affirmative action brought me your way. Tell the Lord, thank you. Be grateful for all that God has given you. God knows what God is doing. She a smart, smart lady.
She's probably black.
And she definitely black.
Joy Reid, thank you.
All right. So you guys seen it, right? That was the last clip. So he asked how Hunt looks in the mirror. How does he sleep at night? On the surface, that sounds like a passionate reaction, but look at what it actually does. It doesn't challenge a single fact Hunt presented. It doesn't offer a counter argument about policy or history or economics. It goes straight to, quote unquote, something must be wrong with you as a person. That's not a debate move. That's what you do when you don't have a rebuttal ready. Then it's escalated. Lemon mentioned that Hunt is in an interracial marriage and asks, quote, what do you tell your black kids? Quote unquote. Think about that for a second. A grown man's children are now part of the argument. His marriage is now on the table. Not his voting record, not his policy positions, his family. Most Americans, regardless of where they stand politically, understand instinctively that when you bring someone's kid into it, you left the conversation behind and enter something else entirely. You made it personal in a way that has nothing to do with the original point. Now, here's where it gets worth paying attention to because Lemon wasn't done. He brought in the Harvard educated guest, Joy Reid, onto the show, who makes an argument about affirmative action and Amy Coney Barrett, right? The argument is that Barrett's appointment of the Supreme Court was essentially affirmative action for conservatives, that she was picked not purely on merit, but because she fit a political need. And on a surface level, there's something there worth discussing. Presidents do consider ideology when they pick justices. That's not a secret. But the problem is the standard being applied. When Biden nominated Ketanji Brown Jackson, he publicly stated he was looking for a black woman. That was his stated criteria before a single name was considered. So when the same guest argues that Barrett benefited from a political selection process while Jackson was chosen purely on merit, the logic doesn't hold up evenly. You can't support affirmative action as a policy. That's a legitimate position. But you can't simultaneously argue that one political selection process is corrupt and another is pure. That's not analysis. That's advocacy wearing a costume of an analyst. That's not an analyst, right? So that's advocacy wearing the costume of an analysis. Then the guest said something that created its own problem, Joy Reid. She admitted that the affirmative action got her into Harvard, acknowledged she may not have gotten in otherwise, and then turned around and said she belonged there because she was smarter than the legacy students. Both of those things can't fully be true at the same time. If the process that admitted you was fair, you don't need to explain why you deserved it. If it wasn't entirely fair, you can't claim the result was purely merit-based. The contradiction was sitting right there in plain sight. And what you're watching across all four of these clips, well, all three of these clips, sorry, not four, each one moves further from the original argument. Wesley Hunt made in closer to personal territory. The mirror comment, the kids, the marriage. When a commentator has to travel that far from the actual point, it usually means the actual point was harder to answer than they expected. So the pattern is clear. But why does it keep happening? Why do media figures with enormous platforms consistently respond to black conservatives the same way? Not with counter arguments, but with questions about their identity and their family. There's a name for what's going on underneath that, and it's worth understanding. Call it the elitist blind spot. It's what happens when someone's platform, income, and social circle pull them so far from everyday reality that they start mistaking their own perspective for universal truth. They're not necessarily lying, they generally can't see outside of it anymore. And when someone shows up whose lived experience doesn't match the framework they built their entire career on, the instinct isn't to engage, it's to question whether that person is legitimate or sane. This isn't a new debate. It's actually one of the oldest arguments in Black American and intellectual history. And understanding where it comes from makes everything happening right now a lot easier to read. At the turn of the 20th century, two of the most brilliant Black minds in America, Webb Dubois and Booker T. Washington, were having almost the exact same argument Hunt and Lemon are having today. Dubois believed that Black Americans needed to confront racism directly and politically. He believed in agitation and demanding full civil and political rights immediately, and what he called the talented 10th, leading the community through education and advocacy. Washington believed in economic self-sufficiency first. Build the business, learn the trade, create something that cannot be taken away. Make yourself so necessary to the economy that exclusion becomes impractical. Both men were responding to the same reality, a country that had freed Black people without giving them land, capital, or protection. And both of them were right about something. Dubois was right that political rights matter and that silence in the face of injustice is not a strategy. Washington was right that economic independence is the foundation that makes everything else possible. Neither one had the complete answer alone. Now apply that to today. Lemon represents the confrontation school. Acknowledge the wound, name the system, demand accountability. Hunt represents the build school. Your history is real, your future is yours, go create it. These are not mutually exclusive ideas. Millions of Black Americans hold both simultaneously without any contradiction. The problem isn't that these two schools of thought exist. The problem is one side decides the other isn't authentically Black for disagreeing. Think about a working class Black father somewhere in this country right now. He coaches Little League on Saturdays. He owns a small business. He votes Republican because he's watched his property taxes rise and his neighborhood change, and he's making decisions based on what he actually sees, not what a cable news panel tells him he should see. Nobody handed him a political script. He's navigating real life with real consequences. Call that man self-hating doesn't help him. It doesn't help his kids, and it just makes the person saying it feel correct. All right, I'm gonna say it again for the people in the back. Calling that man self-hating doesn't help him. It doesn't help his kids. And it just makes the person saying it feel correct. That's the elitist blind spot working in real time. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now let's go back to Lemon's question, because buried underneath the way he used it, there's actually something worth taking seriously. Quote, what do you tell your Black kids? Quote unquote. That's what he said is a real question. It's a question Black parents across this country sit with. The problem wasn't the question. The problem was that he aimed it like a weapon instead of asking it like a human being, genuinely curious about the answer. So let's answer it honestly, because the answer most working American parents give their kids, regardless of race, regardless of zip code, sounds a lot like this: work hard, have integrity, be a good person, believe in yourself, and treat people right, and pursue excellence. That's not a political platform. That's just parenting. And when you strip away the noise, that's exactly what Hunt's life demonstrates to his own children every single day. Now, there's something in the original video that cuts even deeper on this point, right? The mentor story. A white CEO pulls aside a young kid who grew up in the hood, gold teeth and all, and tells him something that reshapes how that kid sees wealth entirely. He says, quote, "I get paid more than Tom Brady for the rest of my life." Not because he played a sport, but because he owns something. He then walks the kid through a reality most people from working class neighborhoods never get exposed to. You know, people who play for the Cowboys, but you don't know the man who owns the Cowboys. You know somebody with a Nike deal, but you don't know the people who own Nike. You know employees, you don't know owners. That gap between knowing employees and knowing owners is one of the most accurate descriptions of the wealth gap in America that you hear in plain English. It's not about racism in that moment. It's about access to information and exposure to a different level of thinking. And that mentor gave it freely to a young black kid with no agenda attached. That's what real mentorship looks like. That's what it produces. Black families who made it through Jim Crow didn't survive by teaching their children the system was unbeatable. Read the history. The families who came out on the other side built something. Even when the system actively tried to stop them, they passed down resilience and faith because those were the only two things nobody could legislate away from them. That tradition didn't disappear. It lives inside every parent who wakes up early, works 2 jobs, coaches the team, and tells their kids by example, not by lecture, what a life of integrity actually looks like. And that's the most powerful thing Wesley Hunt's life communicates to his children. Not a speech, not a talking point. The fact that the great great grandson of a man born on a plantation is now a United States congressman, representing people who look nothing like him, and they chose him anyway. You don't need to explain that to your kids. You just live it and let them watch. Here's something that doesn't get talked about enough in this conversation. Don Lemon wasn't fired from CNN in April 2023 because of his political opinions. CNN has had plenty of opinionated anchors. According to multiple reports at the time, he was let go because of a pattern of behavior that made him difficult to work with, conflicts with colleagues, complaints from staff in a work environment that became unsustainable. His opinions weren't the problem, his conduct was. That distinction matters because conduct and credibility are connected. When you watch someone on television question another man's marriage, or I should say on his YouTube panel, another man's marriage, bring his children into a political argument, and wrap it all in a language about self-hatred, and then you find out that same person had a document pattern of treating the people around him poorly, it fills in a picture. It's not proof of anything on its own, but it's information worth holding. Now let's talk about the double standard that sits right at the center of this, because it needs to be named plainly. Interracial relationships are either acceptable for everyone or they aren't. That's the only logical position available. You cannot criticize a black man or a black guy for marrying a white woman and they stay silent when someone in your own circle does the same thing in a different configuration, right? So the standard has to be consistent, because I say all that to say that Don Lemon is married to someone who is white as well. So what does it matter? It's not about race. You love who you love, and at the end of the day, the person that is your person, you feel as though is your person. So, but my thing is, for Don Lemon, if you want to be that way, the standard has to be consistent, or it isn't a standard at all, right? Sorry for the tongue tie. It's just a tool you pick up when it's convenient. And I don't like that, because now you're ostracizing people, you're belittling people for loving who they love. Most Americans, when you lay it out plainly, recognize that immediately. The contradiction, the weaponization of convenience, because they live by consistent standards in their own lives. They expect the same people or people from television, or, there's a broader institutional point here too. The press exists to challenge power. That's the job. Question a congressman's vote, scrutinize his record, push back on his policy positions with facts and data. That's accountability journalism, and it's worth doing. But the moment a commentator pivots from, quote, here's what's wrong with your argument, to quote unquote, here's what's wrong with your family, they abandoned the job entirely. And beyond that, no media institution has the authority to decide which Black Americans are authentically Black based on how they vote. It's not journalism. It's not journalism at all. That's gatekeeping. And the people it hurts most aren't the politicians. They are the everyday Americans watching at home who hold similar values and suddenly feel like their identity is being questioned because of who they voted for. That's why this controversy moved the way it did. It didn't just spread because people were angry. It spread because it touched something that millions of Americans already felt. That certain big platforms or media voices have appointed themselves the arbitrators of who gets to belong. And the criteria changes depending on whether you're politically useful to them. And people feel that, right? They felt that before they could fully articulate it. And this moment gave them something concrete to point to. Debate the idea, challenge the argument, bring facts, bring history, bring a better solution. That's how this country actually moves forward. The moment you go after a man's kids, his marriage, or his right to exist in his own skin, you already lost the argument. You just don't know it yet. And if this breakdown gave you something real to think about, drop your perspective in the comments. Subscribe for more honest, no nonsense conversations, actually exactly like this one. Spread that peace, love, and positivity. And at the end of the day, it doesn't matter the color of your skin. We're all humans and we should love each other, be productive citizens of our communities, and continue to advocate that resilience, that grit, and let alone be an example for our children, the next generation, to continue to push forward, because you are as great as you continue to move forward. So hopefully that helped. Hopefully I inspired someone. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I'll catch you next one. On that note, family, peace.